You sure about that?
Munch munch, people. Darek here. Imagine if Thanksgiving was like PETA and Vision, but you're all furry, even the turkey, who is also Tess Holiday. What happens when the holiday supply runs low? Will you eat your neighbor, your friend, or yourself? The feasting will smell horrible, yet taste delicious. This disgusting thought experiment brings me to today's game, Tooth and Tail. A game that poses a question of how good of a shot is a squirrel pissing itself off fermented acorn soup, and how hungry do you need to get before your neighbor starts looking like a juicy tenderloin. Developed and published by Pocketwatch Games, TNT would come to the masses on September 12, 2017. The game takes place in anthropomorphized alt history, where children who hate their veggies grew up into adults who hate their veggies. Now 4 factions vie for power over one another, all with the goal of deciding who gets eaten. Gameplay is simple, as in this is literally all you have for controls. Despite the admittedly small options, the game still manages to be open to strategy. This comes down to the units available to the player. You have 3 tiers of various units, alongside a 4th tier of deployables. The design of these guys is top tier, while tier 3 has your hero units like Disney's Robin Hood's Lady Marion, if she respect in the rifles. The other 2 tiers aren't neglected. From Viper Enforcers to Allahu Akbar frogs, even pigeons are in here, functioning as medics.
Fish potière.
The devs did a good job coming up with a variety of units and giving them enough skills to feel different. Sure, you could grab the squirrels with their 6 shooters and triple vision, or you could opt for nomads capable of moving faster and even a touch more health. The trench gang is capable of going invisible, only appearing when they are right on top of their prey. In the single player, you'll be going in with the presets of units instead of selecting like you would with multiplayer. Your goal is largely to manage mills that supply a limited amount of food, which serves as your currency. You can slow or speed this up based on how quickly you construct farms around the mill. Mills and fire pits serve as territory expansion, allowing you to build more structures and have more reserves close by. A faction with no food production begins to starve, and just like real life, will soon die. This makes turtling harder than is normal in the genre, yet if managed well, surprisingly effective. Sure, in Tiberian Wars you can use up all your resources and have to wait for it to replenish, but you won't start to die. Tooth and Tail is actually really rewarding the rush plays against your opponent. I have noticed that in 2v2s, one player setting up defensives like machine gun nest aggressively can be rather effective in stalling the other team's production. The campaign is interesting in that it's handled by running around faction bases. There's not much interactivity to them outside of the brief bit of lore drops. Completing missions unlocks new areas, which once done will have a final mission that swaps you over to the standard bearer of the other faction. It can get a bit confusing as missions can be flashbacks or done at the same time, despite no visual change in the base. Again, they still look great and are visually fun to explore. The music for each faction is great. Nothing I'd go on my way to listen to, but for the tone and the look of the game, it works.
And spoke to.
Entalosti jak psamiacie. Się spłał żołnierze?
Of the factions, the opening one, the Longcoats, is largely just a bunch of tutorial missions. Even the secondary heroic objectives can be completed with ease. Common Folk campaign gets a bit more experimental, with stuff like a stealth mission and more variables within each mission, from desert heat that harms player to food going rotten and living off supply caches. The KSR is where difficulty starts to spike. Sure, most missions are just challenging, but it's a sign of things to come, especially if you try to complete secondary objectives. objectives. I'll touch on the most frustrating mission later, but know that it's in the fourth faction, the Civilized. A brief view of the story is that you have established a system for who gets eaten. However, the Longcoat faction kicks off a revolt against the ruling class of the Civilized. The story is sparse and largely kept to the background, while leaving room for interpretation, so I'll put a timestamp up on the screen if you want to avoid spoilers. It's not the best story, but it is a driving factor for continuing the single player. So let's jump in. It's vague, but some sort of catastrophe struck the crops. This became known as the Blight, and would see animals turning on each other. The Civilized, essentially the church, would organize a harvest where animals either become the tree and serve the church, or become the sun and are ritualistically killed with poison berries. I'm not entirely sure how put together the Moose Pope is. He speaks once, but is mostly silent, and with a look decides who goes where. The only species to accept being eaten is the pigs, who work the grist mills and are trafficked for food. Every faction has a few kicking around, but the game makes it pretty clear that the numbers of swine is dwindling. And since everyone has a taste for meat to the point of calling anything not meat the quote food of the beast, the number keeps going down. Well, one of the children that end up being taken is the son of Belifa. Understandably pissed over this, he would use his money to hire out mercenaries and begin a revolt. His faction, known as the Longcoats, well, barely held together, would cause a fair bit of ruckus against the Civilized and the KSR. Eventually, a shaky alliance is formed between the Longcoats and the common folk. Well Bellified believes in raising oneself up, and this should warn who is eaten. The common folk push for a vote on who to eat, or at least Hopper pushes for it. Never really addressing how that would lead to more problems as well, like gang voting and mob rule, but none of the faction's ideals really work out. Hopper is a standard bearer for the common folk. Her claim to fame is that she literally gave her arm for the hungry, though it is hinted she resorted to self-cannibalism.
yourself.
Out of all the characters, she's easily the most optimistic one. The KSR are all about maintaining order and safety, even if they have to fight a war to secure it.
I cherish peace with all my heart. I don't care how many men, women, and children I need to kill to get it.
The game hints that they are a mixture of secret police and the enforcers of the civilized. The leader is the quartermaster, who is really just trying to keep everything together. Whereas the Longcoats got the likes of the Distiller Brothers and the common folk have nomads, the KSR gets more militarized units like the AFB and the Sergeant Hero. In addition to this, the KSR gets a bonus for the majority of their levels. With the two prior ones, you had the Bill of Warren, which would construct and then automatically spawn a set amount of soldiers so long as you had the food. That is, unless you had them all, which would singularly spawn anywhere on the map, even outside of friendly territory. The KSR is able to utilize this, but for all units. So instead of paying 60 food to build a Squirrel Warren, which would then spawn 20 food for each of the 3 spawns, you now spend 20 to get 1 squirrel. In addition to this, they get access to militarized sugar for a mission, which is somewhat effective in game. The final faction you play as is the Civilized, as one of their leaders, Archimedes. They're the ones in charge for the majority of the game. Their Moose Pope decides who is eaten and who is spared to serve. However, it becomes clear that there is favoritism to those already aligned with them over the standard citizenry. However, come the end game and after all the fighting, they are the only faction reliably putting out food. So reliably, in fact, that the heroes from the other factions show up at the table. So this is where it starts to get a bit more complicated. The heroes show up in various bases, pushing the story forward. Kasha is a spy for the KSR, meanwhile Uncle Butter ends up cooking for the various factions. He's imprisoned by the KSR, openly gives them information about the Longcoats and the Common Folk Alliance. Both he and inmate 43B are freed when the Civilized turn on the KSR. Off screen from all of this, the Tsarina, who is essentially treated like Stalin's daughter, Svetlana. If you've seen Death of Stalin, you'll get where I'm going with that.
Hello, Svetlana! They're trying to cut you off. Where? It's obvious. Svetlana! Svetlana!
Everyone loves her to the point that every faction mentions her fondly. Bellified even says they'll keep the fighting out of the city so as not to upset her. Well, when you hit the KSR campaign, it's revealed that someone poisoned the Tsarina. The church uses a poisonous berry to execute those chosen for the sun. In addition to this, an attack by the civilized leaves so little food that the three-way alliance breaks down, and everyone is hearing word of a final battle where the other factions will be at their most weak. The last room of the civilized is talking with a swine, who tells Archimedes they have a way for him to win the war. This being the same message, but with the civilized thinking they're the only one aware of the information. Throughout the game, it's been pretty obvious that the swine were smarter than anyone gave them credit. Bellified is even surprised the swine can speak his name, and from there you can predict the twist long before it happens. So when all the factions march on each other, they go until one is left standing. Then the swine show up. The number of swine wasn't dwindling, but instead going underground. So while the factions ate each other, including POWs, the swine were building up numbers. You can beat the horde, but the canon ending seems to be at the pigs win. Either way, the credits just start rolling, and honestly, it's an okay ending, but a bit anticlimactic. Some sort of outro cutscene would have been appreciated, but it's a fine, if subdued, ending. I will say it would have made sense for Uncle Butters to be with them, as it stated he's the only one with access to Bellified's supply. He also is a boar, which is in the pig family. Now, I did have one huge problem with the game. One big push of the game is how the maps can be randomized. I largely played through with the standard maps, which are fine, though the isometric view and some odd choices can lead to stuff looking passable but being blocked off. The random stuff leads to one of the most headache-inducing missions, being the vacancy downfall. So at some point they had snakes, but those were swapped out for moles in a patch. Now the enemy team seems to have an unlimited funding and will be backed up by 2 more in short order. So you naturally rush the enemy grist mills. However, you have to deal with the random wind, which will either speed you up or slow you down, on top of freezing temperatures progressively slowing you down. This plagues the heroic objective, as you're required to spend a little over a minute running around finding all the possible food sources. So if you randomize, you're unable to restart and play off the same map. But if you use standard, you're basically stuck with RNG that takes time away from you being able to build an army for the near immediate squirrel swarm. That isn't even counting on the reinforcing armies. Also, you can only move an entire army or a group of 1 unit type. I would have liked to have a button to lead a group immediately near me when I click a button. It would have made managing map control much easier on later levels. Finally, the game can easily experience slowdown, especially when the enemy rushes chafe into your barbed wire. So to sum it up, Tooth and Tail is a fun game that is let down by some poor map design, ridiculous difficulty spikes, and performance issues. I couldn't suggest the game at full price, especially since I didn't get any matches with the multiplayer. However, it is a fun, simplistic RTS that is a different approach to the genre. Come to the table and dig in if you get it on sale. I'm either off to join the militia or a shady merc group for a biochemical company.
Jauzifalt, Guliot Halgia, Blutinge, Ziviak Wol, Joviak Bus, Paola, Multivolbie, Silzitia Change, Kievengal, Paola, Ziviak Wol, Joviak Bus, Silzitia Change, Blutinge.
And now, folks, it's time to say goodnight. We sincerely appreciate your patronage and hope we've succeeded in bringing you an enjoyable evening of entertainment. Please drive home carefully and come back again soon. Good night.